Policymakers. We share our findings how progress in transport, energy and digital can impact not only the market but also the institutions. For us in the applicant countries like the Western Balkans, institutional connectivity is key. I am honored to moderate this panel. Especially, I think it is extremely important that we talk now. It's the time to talk about consumers. We have been talking about the market and the cooperation with the third countries during the morning sessions. Now, we will focus on how regulators and the other stakeholders are reacting to the new challenges and how consumers are profiting and how they're being protected. I have the honor to be in the same panel as with Mr. Charles Esser from Council of European Energy Regulators, with Mr. Stefano Besseghini, President of Italian regulator ARERA, and Mrs. Cristina Portugal Andrade, President of Portuguese regulator Entidade, Reguladora dos Serviços, Energéticos. I excuse myself for my Portuguese. So basically we will start with the most obvious thing, which is the clean energy for all package, which will enable consumers to produce, consume and sell from renewables. Basically this entails a few things, such make it easy and worthy for the consumers to play in the market, adopt and profit from new business model, which is being now developed, and this will mean a lot of protection. We will talk it later. And also get the best from energy systems of the future, like the system balances, and we will touch it also later on. But first of all, when I was discussing with my with the fellow panelists about this, about how to better organize this panel, Mr. Esser told me that yesterday he's been in a working table about consumers and the clean energy for all package, and I thought it is fantastic, it is great. Nobody else can do or can set up the scene after this, I would say, quite comprehensive roundtable. And my first question would go to you. I mean, what is the main thing that you took away from those discussions yesterday that you can share with us now?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm the Secretary General of CEER, and I would also like to say, of course, many members of MEDREG are members or observers in CEER, and also that we have a cooperation agreement with MEDREG that was concluded in December 2018. So I'm very pleased to be here and look forward to continued cooperation and engagement with MEDREG in the future. Yes, CEER had its annual customer conference yesterday, which was entitled Consumers at the Heart of Implementing the Clean Energy Package. And there were four sessions in it, and I don't want to go through the whole conference now. I really have a presentation, which I'll get into in a minute. But to respond to Ardian's question, one thing that really struck me was this idea of, first of all, consumers being more empowered so that they're more active, more protected, their bills are better, they can participate in the market, there are new forms for them to participate, whether it's energy communities or self-consumption. But also to think that when we think about the energy transition, which is really behind the clean energy package, to think about how does that really happen, and a lot of that will be not directly through consumers, but also through them driving large and medium-sized enterprises to change through the incentives that are out there, through what they're going to demand. And I think that if we really are going to have a successful clean energy package and a successful energy transition, it will really be, I think one of the points that I really took away was this idea of consumers driving changes in supply chains, and that really making a difference in terms of the energy transition. So I think with that, and having mentioned a bit self-consumption and energy communities, and the topic of this panel is distributed generation, I'd like to move into my presentation, which I see is there, and so that I can actually see which slide I'm on. I'm going to stand up, if you don't mind, and I'll go over and just go through the presentation quickly. What I should say that I'm not a distributed generation expert. I'm not a person in an NRA that spends most of my day looking at distributed generation. But what I can do with this presentation is give you a bit of an overview of some thoughts of CEER on the topic, and maybe a bit lead into some of the following presentations. So I look a bit at self-generation, look a little bit at distributed generation, power losses, including a case study example, and look at a little bit at energy sharing and communities. With self-generation, I mean, this is not something new, I don't think, for anyone in this room. I mean, there's the idea of final customers, which are partially covering their own needs, and that's something, of course, that if it's just in the sense of a lower demand profile because they don't need to draw on the grid quite as much, there's, of course, less regulatory concern. But when we start to look into them feeding into the grid, then we do have issues, and we think about things like, what kind of contract do they have with the supplier? I mean, how should that contract be made? Does the consumer really understand how that contract works? Is it clear? Looking at that as well, when the customer is thinking about if they're feeding into the grid, what kind of contract they have? Are there comparison tools that will allow them to best understand which contract is best for them? So that means comparison tools have to be more sophisticated. Of course, you need adequate smart metering to be able to do that. And so if smart metering is not rolled out, of course, that makes it very difficult. And it needs to be smart metering that's of a more recent type to fully take advantage. And I think there's also equity issues there. So you're thinking about cost-reflective tariffs. Are the tariffs right? Are so that even people who are feeding into the grid are still paying their proper share of the network costs? You don't want to privilege self-generators versus those who cannot. And of course, it's a long-standing CEER position to avoid net metering, which is that we don't really want the energy system to be used sort of as a free storage by those feeding into the grid. And that's something that's a long-standing CEER position. So I think one interesting thing, and it's a little bit off of consumers, but I'll bring it back into consumers, is this issue of distributed generation and power losses. And we often think about distributed generation, as reducing power losses because you're having the generation close to the consumer, and you don't have to take it, obviously long distances. You have losses and so forth, but in addition, if you have less transformational steps, you also reduce losses. However, if you have distributed generation that's further away, and in distributed generation here, I'm thinking about perhaps small wind parks, small solar facilities that are on the medium or low voltage grids, which we can also think of as distributed generation. It's not just rooftop solar. Then there could be potentially not the most beneficial option. It could be that, for example, it's not synchronous with demand, or that it's very distant. Of course, when you or that you have to take more transformational steps. So you have, let's say, distributed generation that's on a medium or low voltage grid has to be taken up to the high voltage and then back down again on a far away point of consumption. So this is actually a case study that was in one of our reports. It's a case study from Spain, and you can see there that when the DSO was importing distributed generation from a fairly far distance away of wind power, that they were very large losses. And some of those losses were having to take power up from a medium voltage or low voltage grid up into the transmission grid, and then back down again to the distribution grid. And it was mostly wind power that was far away. So distributed generation could actually create losses in the system, and so this has implications, of course, for market design, and also has implications for consumers, which I'll get to at the end of this short presentation. There we go. Okay. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is selling local energy and consuming within a project. So there's actually no physical way assume that local production goes to those consumers if it's actually shared on a grid. So you have things like virtual energy sharing and so forth. If it is in a public grid, then of course you have to have it be balance responsible if it's above a certain amount, and that's in the clean energy package, as I've noted there, that the 400 kilowatt greater are balance responsible parties in the clean energy package. I think for us as regulators is looking at these communities as quite positive in the sense of customers being able to join together to be able to, for example, put renewable projects together. At the same time, we don't think that they should be means to avoid network costs. So it could be that they don't have a positive impact on the network, and this is actually something quite could be quite sophisticated in terms of having to deal with how it affects the network. And so we think that the incentive, it's very important to get those incentives when you have a local energy community that's feeding into the grid, to get those incentives right, so that it just creates a positive effect for the system. Now, a few issues with sharing that I'd like to bring out here. As I mentioned before, just like with individuals, you have to have adequate grid fees. If it's on the public system, you need to have those effects for the grid be a benefit for the grid. Secondly, we think that when the supplier is engaged, we still need the self-generation it could be that it coincides with high market prices when there's not self-generation available. So that also needs to be reflected in the grid and needs to be reflected in costs. Self-generation, particularly when they're still dependent on outside sources when they can't cover their consumption, that needs to be fairly costed. Also, suppliers have public service obligations. The local energy communities, citizens energy communities, renewable energy communities have those same public service obligations. This is something for member states to still consider and think about how to best do that. So if the supplier remains responsible for covering costs that are on the system, how should the community then be held responsible if not directly? Sorry. There we go. Lastly, I'd like to go back into consumers and think a little bit about consumer rights, because that's really where this panel was focused on. So one of the things we think about with energy communities is thinking about, does the consumer still have rights? What are the consumer's rights? If the consumer is a member of an energy community, that's kind of an interesting situation, because the consumer is a member, but at the same time the consumer still has all the rights of changing and leaving the supplier. So that must be taken into account in the way that these energy communities are set up. And at the same time, energy communities can't be exclusive. They can't prevent certain people from joining, just like an energy retailer can't say, well, can't put a category of people out from being a customer. At the same time, it's very important to have proper information so that consumers understand very well what they're getting into when they join such a community. They should be able to freely change. If they're not happy being in an energy community, they should be able to go back to a traditional supplier if they want. Finally, going back to the previous example on power losses, I think it's important to consider costs for consumers and market design as we have increasing distributed generation in the system. One of the things that I want to mention is procurement of losses. Of course, when you have those high losses, they need to, the way that, at least in 2017, when CEER last did a kind of survey, was in most member states, those losses are passed back on to consumers, which we think is suboptimal. We're currently doing a new report now where we'll see what the status is in member states, but we think that it should be incentivized so that those losses are not passed on to consumers, and that market design of distributed generation should be set up optimally so as to minimize losses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. I noticed basically took my attention the takeout from what we discussed yesterday on the consumers being more active, or as you said, just to quote you, being in the driving seat of the transition. And this is very, very important because it passes from, let's say, individual consumer that installs solar panels in a rooftop and some active player, I would say, into policy making and also into drafting new regulatories. In your speech, it is easy to understand the importance of the transparency, the importance of fairness regarding the cost, and I would also ask, especially with the communities, the equitable access versus the big producers, so to say, to the policy making. And here it brings me, let's say, very naturally to the role of the regulators into protecting the consumer. This new business model that we are seeing right now with the distributed generation has seen new providers, new prosumers, new suppliers come to the market, but also a large or a very considerable number of suppliers getting out of the market. While just going through some figures, when preparing about the moderation, I just learned that in UK, 14 suppliers have gone bust since 2018, since June 2018. And nobody, it was unclear at this moment who would cover the bailout costs and what would be the red flags for the consumers, for example, in this case, so that they will know in advance that they can prepare. So the first risk is bankruptcy. Another risk that we have identified is to discuss, and will be discussed in this panel, are the bundled products. I don't want to take as example my grandfather or my grandmother, but I mean, I'd like to, be a candidate myself. I have problems understanding them, and I am an averagely intelligent person. So there are challenges, uncertainties, and need for more information about understanding these products. What are the main principles for a good bundled product, right? So, I mean, what the companies should do when they sell them. What should regulators do with a bundled product? I am very pleased to invite Ms. Portugal to share with us her very extensive and exhaustive experience with both issues, bankruptcy and also bundled product, and also other consumer protection experience from her job in Portugal. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ardian. Thank you very much for having me today.
Okay. It's a pleasure to be here with you. 2 or 3 brief words before starting my presentation. It's clear, there's no denial that we are in a moment of big change in the energy sector. Change has never been so fast, and it will never be so slow as today. So there are new actors, new technologies, new services, new consumers, prosumers, and there are quite a lot of old, traditional, conservative consumers. The majority of consumers will still is these kind of consumers. And as faster as we go, as larger is the risk to leave those consumers behind, and we do not wish to leave any consumers behind. And I will have some slides. I'm going to pass. I have a lot of slides, so I'm going to pass it quite quickly. And I know. Should I point where? Okay. But it will be available for you if you want after that. So we are trying to measure the correct impact of all those changes that we are foreseeing to consumers, and we are naturally aware and working together with consumer associations and other regulators. There are more choices, and it's complex. It's very complex. Even today, the simple energy supply is complex. So if you add layers to the energy supply, it will be impossible to foresee what you have to do. And it's quite okay if you move to technology, but you do have to care, always to care and always to protect the ones that are living and are left behind. So what I wish to focus today is two projects we have in CEER, and we have those two projects which are a response to problems we have identified within European countries. One of those is RAPEX. It's called, it's baptized, the name of RAPEX means rapid exchange from people that, like me, they are working on consumer affairs for a long time. They know this is the name of a system that exists from the 90s for dangerous products. So there's a system of information with all European countries that alert the other countries there's a product, namely toys. This is dangerous, please get it out of the market. So the name is the same, but not the product. What we have identified is quite all right, competition is good, allows lower prices, better services eventually, but in some cases, and with some, it's natural that not all suppliers survive in the market. Some because they do not wish to enter the market to survive, but just a scam. Others because they cannot, they are not, they have no ability and no capacity of surviving in the market. And this leads to costs, you have mentioned it, Adrian, and those costs finally have to be borne by the other consumers, and because as you know, as a regulator, you have to always have the last resource to apply in order consumers do not get without any electricity. So rapid exchange of information. What do we want with RAPEX is to have fast information of who is not paying their bills in other countries, and so regulators may be alert, may prevent, and eventually may control the damages of the company go into insolvency. I have to mention that there is an European bankruptcy law that means it allows some photoshopping of the place and the country where you put and you present your insolvency procedure. So theoretically, a French company or an English company may present a bankruptcy file, and the judge may just avoid and just say, well, all the contracts must be on. You cannot cancel contracts, and that could be applied to all countries. We had these cases in Portugal, actually the Spanish suppliers, and that was the leitmotif that made us to propose to CEER to create this system. And actually, by this moment, we have several German, Netherlands, Portuguese, and United Kingdom companies that have already presented to bankruptcy, either in gas, either in electricity. And this was launched earlier this year. This is not yet completely full, but it's a problem, and it should be constructed, and it's a going on project. We should have the suppliers eventually have a better identification of the suppliers, of the shareholders that we have identified. They are the same. And eventually in the future having some scams and some exchange of information of unfair commercial practices that are very easily exportable to other countries. So they start in one country and they get along to the other countries. On bundle products, another situation we have identified in Portugal. I mean, we had in 2015 around 200,000 contracts join with the electricity supply. We have now around 1,200,000, so it's moving on, and a very, very interesting kind of offers. We have all kinds of products that are nowadays being served with electricity, and that poses a problem to consumers. I have some examples in here. Well, we have discounts, selling flowers, you have repairs, you still don't have massages, but I think it will come one of those days. But you have all kinds of services that are together with your energy bill and your energy supply. Of course, there are some benefits for consumers. He doesn't have to search for other suppliers. But there is a big risk, and the bigger is not being aware of what is making a contract, and what kind of contract he's making, and what is really the benefit that is coming. Major risks for consumers is, after a while, who is going to complain to? How many companies did I make a contract with? Which one is the regulator I'm going to apply when I have a problem? And being a regulator, how can you act against a practice, against a contract which is not on your scope of activities? Supply energy with an insurance. Okay, insurance, it's not mine, it's another regulator. And so there's quite a few problems and quite a few situations that we are facing. We have issued in 2017, we have issued a recommendation on bundle products in energy. One of the recommendations is to split exactly the energy with the bundle products in order the consumer may identify, and never let the bundle product affect or interfere with the supply of energy. Meaning, if I do not pay a bundle, I cannot be interrupted by my energy supply if I pay the energy supply. So this was raised also within CEER, although I think we are the most creative in Portugal with bundle products. It's coming in several other countries. And there was a big discussion for 2 years now what kind of things that could be done, and CEER presented today what are the principles, and issued 10 principles that are applied to companies, and 3 principles applied to regulators that should be followed cross-sectorial, meaning all sectors and all regulators should apply these principles. You can make a consultation on CEER site on all this, and getting to the principles: transparency, simplicity, having the information clear, having comparison tools that allow you to compare with and without bundle products, having the possibility the customer switch with or without a bundle and get off of a bundle, and mainly we still have to protect the essential service, which is the supply of energy. And for regulators, of course, educate, being very clear in what products belong to whom, and coordinate between themselves in order to solve the problem of the consumer without having the consumer in a kind of ping-pong game between regulators, ADRs, and whatever. And of course, monitor bundle products and cooperate across sector. So those are main principles. They have issued and approved today within CEER. I hope still going on. This is ongoing work, and in order to protect consumer and working hard to do it. And I think I have, yes, MEDREG presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for making clear those bundled things. Complicated things, and I just want to quote some keywords that I took from your presentation, like simplicity of information, like the main principles, or clear liability principles, or clear identification of who is the complaint handler, transparency of price and of different elements, no disconnection of essential services. And this brings me to something which for me it is extremely important. The role of the regulator also in the social field, not only as a lawyer that and a player in the market that makes sure that the market plays well, but also as a protection of basic services. And this is extremely important role that I think must be put forward for this regulator in this case. It's a social role. And now it is very interesting because we are moving from the consumers or prosumers that are, I would say, following these big changes that you, Ms. Portugal, just mentioned, and trying to adapt and to be protected, into consumers that are being actors of those futures. It's like these science fiction movies, which I think have become, at least the scenario is being written somewhere in Italy. You started in 2018, Mr. Besseghini, in November 2018 with the UVAM. You will explain us what it means, in order to help and contribute to the ancillary market. And the reason, if I understood well, was quite simple and evident, is that if the main suppliers of flexibility today are fossil fuel plants, in the future, with the energy transitions, there will be prosumers of renewables. So many different input sources and from many very little producers. So basically, until you started this future last year, and you'll tell us what it means, but just some little numbers which are which are amazing. From 250 production units that you had in the past, you'll go to 800 production units and to 40 million consumption units in distribution, generation, renewables, and storage. And here, if I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're also counting electric cars. Can you take us into the future, please?
I don't know if I bring you to the future, but I will try to explain how we are trying to build our safety for the future, which is probably even more important. But let me start first, before entering in, I have a very short presentation, just 4 or 5 slides to give some numbers. I would like to recall the starting point of my previous colleague, because I am completely convinced of this point, that prosumers are not leading the market in this moment. The large amount of consumers are still stuck to some old-fashioned way of consuming the energy, and be aware they are looking for the price. They are looking for the cost of the energy bill, and this is one of the major driven. We are experiencing in this period in Italy the complete liberalization of the market, and at the moment we have roughly half of the consumer in the free market, half of the consumer in what is called the maggior tutela, which is a regulated price system. And those moving from the regulated price are basically looking for contracts which has fixed price in a 1-year period and that's the main service that they are looking for. So we put in the center of our strategic plan for the next 3 years awareness of the consumer, which is of course a never-ending story, because building this awareness is always a very complicated thing, but for sure we need to do a lot of work from this point of view. And regulators have a central point in defining clear and understandable rules and situation for the consumers. From this point of view, even if I have not the slides, I would like to mention at least two, I think, important things that we have done in the last 2 years, in the last couple of years as an Italian regulator, which is the activation of what is a public and independent comparator of offers of the different suppliers in the market. At present, since half 2018, from beginning 2019, we have a complete list of all the offers that are present in the market, compared with the regulated price. So everybody can enter this website, compare, just giving very simple information, no personal data at all, only where you live and what is your roughly annual consumptions. And with this you can have an independent comparison of the different offers. Of course we have a problem with the bundles, because it is always like that, because when you are working with a discount, it's much more easy to manage. But when you are building, I always make a joke that it's difficult to manage the supply of pineapples for the next 12 months. This is very difficult to compare in a global offer. But at this moment, the comparator works like with the optionals in the car offers. They put in a separate evidence, and so you can have at least a clear indication of the bundle. But I really appreciate the presentation of this bundles topics, because it's really a matter. And another point that we did is we started in July 2019 with what we call the Portale Consumi, which is a website for having your own data on consumptions. So you can enter this portal, and you can have a global overview of your situation from the contractual point of view and from the consumption point of view at present for the last 12 months. And the idea is to extend this to the last 36 months. What is important, what is interesting is that in this portal you have also the information about the switching, of which you are somehow main actor, because you know this switching can be a requested one, but sometimes it happens, unfortunately, that we have also unrequested switching, and so you can have evidence that your contract has been managed at your will or not, and you, of course, you can react contacting the authority or whatever. And a last point that I think is really important, at least to mention, because it's really a protection of the consumer, at least. It's a very important instrument to understand those situations like bankruptcy or any kind of misalignment between the fluxes of the money and for the system is what we call I try to translate like informatic integrated systems, sistema informativo integrato, which is a collection of all the data of the different suppliers and of all the different consumers in Italy that are managed on a monthly basis, so that you can have a clear evidence of what is going on for every consumer, and you can dramatically reduce the amount of time needed, for example, for switching. It's something very similar to the central information system for the telecom system. So we activated this since at least 3 or 4 years now, and it's really gaining momentum, because it's really an instrument that is habilitating a lot of new services, but which is more important, a lot of informations, because you know that data and information are the basic, the key, the most important things that we have to manage. Before moving to UVM, which will take only a small part of my contribution at this point, just another point that I would like to raise at least for the discussion, and we can discuss in another moment. Be aware of the effect of digitalization, because things like smart contracts will enter quite quickly in our regulatory issues. And from this point of view, we must be very careful to be future-proof, because we must be aware of what this kind of technologies will be able to implement. In that case, the consumer will immediately collect a large amount of decision in one single step. And what is important is the habilitation of the algorithm that implements the contracts, not the contract itself. So it changes a little bit the focus of our activity of regulators, that moves from a relationship between the vendor and the client, the customer, to something more internal to the building up of the offers. So now I have to stand up because we have no monitor in front, which is always a problem. This one. Very quickly, I just put a couple of plots, and I apologize for a little bit of Italian somewhere, but it will not change the understanding of the plot. This is the installed power in Italy since the very beginning, 1931 to 2018. You see here the small nuclear experience of Italy, which is just a paint of green of green actually in our development. And here you see the largest, very large amount of renewables coming in starting from 2010 more or less. And if you want to have a more detailed view of this huge steep, because it is actually a huge steep, we moved from 3.5 gigawatt installed in 2010 to 12.8 gigawatt in 2011. It means 1 year you make a step of more than 9 gigawatt. And consider that the PNIEC, the Clean Energy Package declinated in the national environment, requires a further step of this amount in the next more or less 10 years. So we have a lot of work to do, even more. Look always to the reasonable amount of hydropower that we have at the bias of the system, which is always to have to be aware of this. But I don't want, of course, focus on this evolution, which I think more or less is known to all of you. But this is the prerequisite for understanding how the environment in which our consumer moves is dramatically changed. Now, he faces a lot of different contributions to understanding the energetic system, to use the energetic systems. I think we have still a problem. And the problem is that the consumer is not pulling the system. The consumer is pushed by the system. That's the point. If you look at the digitalization services, it comes a moment in which the request from the consumer is higher than the offer from the producers. And that's the point in which you had the over-the-top coming in, you have this increasing speed in technology and in innovation. In the energetic system, we are not yet facing this situation. We have a very strong policy push for decarbonization. We have a very strong push from the technology, but yet the consumer is a little bit scared of what is going on and probably not really pushing for the services. And you know, economical laws say that the request for services is the main driving force for more or less everything. But if you want to have this prosumer or consumer somehow activated by a system which is able not simply to offer something, but to create an ecosystem in which the consumer is able to recognize himself and act properly, you need to build something. You need to build this environment in which the offers and the technological opportunities comes out quite smoothly. And one of the options, not the only one, but one of the options is to exploit a an interesting market, which is the stabilization market, the services that you need to maintain stable the grid and the systems, which are the ancillaries markets, not the primary ones, which can benefit from services coming from a new actor, basically. We call them, but it's not the original one, it comes from European law, the balancing service provider, a subject that is able to put in place in between the TSO and an ecosystem of industrial producer, of prosumers, more or less evoluted, energy communities, what else. And on a market basis, it's able to offer services. That's the UVAM. UVAM is an acronym for virtual unit, habilitated virtual unit mixed, because we started the first projects with the production unit, then the consumer unit, and at least we realized that probably it's better to have a mixed one. Of course, the model more or less satisfied the market. It's a small one, but satisfied the market. And now we have proposals for new projects. I have forgotten to say that all these are experimental projects of the authorities. I mean, we started with these pilot projects, these pilot regulatory ideas, in order to habilitate a relatively small amount of this proposal. And this is a first outcome of this experiment, let's say, which started, as you can see, roughly in November 2018. Here are data up to the end of April 2019. We have to generate the report for the next months. But more or less, things are clear, at least in this experimental phase, which already has been exploited in a consultation document that is starting what we call the new dispatching system. And you can see here the stripes, the light blue stripes, are the offered quantities. In this case, it's the service in rising the power. And the spots, the red different colors, are the offered price and the accepted price, which are this one. These are the averages. Of course, you can see very quickly here that everything goes to the top. They want the maximum available remuneration very quickly. Why? Because what you can see here, which are these small points, should be lines, but points at present, dark blue, which are the accepted offers. So the TSO accepted a relatively small amount of the offers presented. This is the rising services. This is the lowering energy services. In this case, there are no accepted offer. This is typically the offer made by the renewables, because they are able to decrease the power very quickly, and they're much more difficult in increasing the power. So what comes out from this first experimental view? It comes out that we have succeeded. I have the numbers now. We have roughly 1 gigawatt offered as a mixed service from the renewables and from cogenerators and from conventional plants and so on. We have succeeded in habilitating this ecosystem, in promoting the renewables, in starting offering in the market services for the stabilization of the grid. Of course, we still have a TSO which is a little bit reluctant in using these services, because they are difficult to manage. You need to develop even the control room technologies and softwares to be able to manage properly this overs of stabilization. It's much more easy to buy services, conventional services from a larger plant at present. But we are in the initial stage. We need to build this ecosystem, and we are very confident that this will be a good environment in which prosumer can actually give a value to the services that they are able to do. Just to give a practical example, in Lombardy, in the last 2 years, the regional government promoted the adoption of storage system at the private solar plants. They supported probably 3,000 more or less of these plants with an average power of about 6 kilowatt. And now we are, okay, not we, people are trying to collect all this storage and build up a virtual system that is able to contribute to this kind of services. This means values that comes back to the consumer as for a real service, for something which is very transparent to him. Now, more or less I have finished. Of course, I'm here for all your questions, but take care that when you think to have all the answers, life changes all the questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for presenting this system and these pilot projects. And just to open the discussion, I'll profit from the fact that I'm moderating, so I'll ask the first question. It struck me in the presentation of all the three panelists that when we talk about the participation of prosumers or the consumers in the system, in this ecosystem that you mentioned, we arrive at moments when we have, and I'm quoting you, Mr. Besseghini, an absorption of information from consumers which is large and immediate, and we talk about huge volume of data. So I'm throwing in the discussion something I didn't notice in the morning session neither, the notion of artificial intelligence and of 5G. So, I mean, does it make sense to talk about this right now? I mean, is European Union prepared to deal with it? And are there criticalities in this new business model? It's open to any of you. Please.
Well, I think you're right about the enormous amount of information. I think that in terms of energy communities, could be a way to sort of allow consumers who to band together to have someone to provide that, to have it be cost efficient through a bit of economy of scale, to have more information, to be able to, as I was saying, be able to provide the network the proper, be able to provide for the network the proper services, to be able to adjust properly, which I think is an issue that CEER has identified with the growing number of energy communities that will be out there, particularly with the clean energy package. You know, we have a digitalization paper that looks at some issues with digitalization, and particularly with DSOs being much smarter. You know, this is one of the things that's very important for having a greater amount of flexibility and actually being able to incorporate, of course, all this variable renewable power that was discussed. So that increasing digitalization is absolutely essential for the energy transition. I think I'll just leave it at that.
No, I just want to underline and having some step backs and not all consumers will be prosumers, never. It's a kind of new consumer right, the right to be simple, the right to be normal, to be plain, just to switch on and off. Consumers, to be a prosumer, the side of the production, it's an economic activity. It's not consumption. It may be a social statement because I want to participate in the system. I want to help climate changes, but it's not regular consumption. So those ones will still remain. They will not be energy geeks, and they will still remain for some long time anyway, although things are going very fast, the majority of consumers. And that's the seeing things going very fast on digitalization, on sharing data, on protecting consumers. I always tend to reaffirm and coming back Okay, there is this large amount of people that will still stay as regular, simple, normal, plain consumers, switching on and switching off the light, and they will still have to be protected, and at the end of the day, not paying the bill of the infrastructure.
I agree with this. Just, I would like to raise a small concern. That's really correct that there are a large amount of customers that will switch on and switch off. Unfortunately, those switch on, switch off will be mapped, will give rise to a data mapping of their habits, and they will receive some commercial pressure because of their behavior. So of this we must be aware. Yes. This is unavoidable. This is probably real up to now. The question of the moderator is if we have to take care of artificial intelligence and 5G. Let's 5G on another discussion, otherwise we open a 2 hours session. Even artificial intelligence is really a topic. I would say one thing. You see that dramatic increase in the installed power in Italy in roughly 1 year. That didn't give rise to any significant problem to the system, and I touch, of course, something now, because of the large amount of automation that is inside of the system. Otherwise, it would be the acceptance level of the Italian energetic system has been raised very quickly because of a huge amount of automation and digitalization which has been promoted even by this authority. So I think this is very often misrecognized, but should be clearly stated. So now, artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence will move very roughly on 2 levels. The first one is maintenance, predictive maintenance, which is dramatic for cost reduction and cost management, especially for resilience. And in that case, all the stuff regarding digital twins, modelization of the systems, simulations of operational system will come in place, and that will be managed only with artificial intelligence. And I think that European technologies are not good, are in forefront, because they come from a great skill in the electric power systems. Then there is another topic of artificial intelligence, which is management of the behavior of the consumers. That's a much more complicated issue. I have no clear answer. I have only this clear warning that we must be able, as regulators, to hold some kind of interconnection with the other regulators of the other areas, from the telecommunication, for the privacy, for the data protection, for the market systems. If we don't build a clear interconnection between all these regulators, we will fail this battle, because you will never be able to tackle it in the specific area of your regulation. If the over-the-tops comes in the electric market, you cannot face them with the regulation on the primary or substation. You must manage something which is much more in this area of. So I have no the answers, of course. I have the attention that to be placed in the right place, and this cooperation, I think, is really important.
Thank you.
May I add something here? My name is Mohammed Al-Tahan from the Egyptian Gas Regulator Authority. My background coming from the telecom and the SCADA systems, I think my voice is hard. The 5G and the artificial intelligence actually will enable the consumer at the end of the day to be an intelligent producer of information. In the telecom era, I think the evolution of the added value services for the consumer coming from allowing the telecommunication, the speed, the protection, the mobility, and the analytics that coming from those kind of information. In the energy sector, if we are moving for the smart grids, for the electricity, for example, and the gas is behind a little bit from the electricity, but they are moving on the same era, deploying the information. How to set the analytics of the market, the commercial analytics, the electrical, the technical analytics that will allow for the predictive maintenance, predicting the market shares of the companies, the distribution companies, when they are collecting the information from the consumers through the meters, the smart meters. The Internet of Things, one of the guys here was talking about the Internet of Things deployment for the grids. I think the communities and the systems are moving very fast to deploy such kind of Internet of Things, which called Industrial Internet of Things. And there is also another notions called authorization of the systems or authorization of the services that makes the consumer like and the grid like an Uber. Okay, the consumer will get the service and get the benefit of the service as long as he can take added values from the information. He will be active to be prosumers as well. And the virtual grids. This is just only my addition in this point of discussion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I quote some tweetable phrases? With your permission, artificial intelligence, I call them tweetable phrases. So, artificial intelligence will enable the consumer to be intelligent. It's yours. No, intelligent in the sense that being as good as the network allows. I think it's perfect.
On Twitter, you can never say in the sense. You must be clear.
Assess the analytics of the markets. I mean, now my take is that now the consumers or the individual consumer with a rooftop with a solar panel is much more defavorized as compared with big industrial units, for example. Artificial intelligence will change that in favor of the consumer.
Look, artificial intelligence actually is an engine for analyzing data and predicting things and correlating different variables. For the consumer, when it comes to the meter, the smart meter, and he can see the values, the consumption, and he can gain another access for other services or added value services, like, for example, I can manage my bill, I can manage my consumption. When I play the role of the prosumer, I can manage how can I generate electricity in the profiles, the different profiles. This is from the consumer perspective. From the distribution or the collection or, the transmission, when they are gaining all such kind of information, they can predict the behavior of the consumers, the behavior of the network, to downsize the losses of the network. It's exactly like the telecommunication changes or the telecommunication works. It works like this. So I think we are, as regulators, we have to drive the market for the smart grids in the electricity and in the gas as well. Okay.
Great, thank you. I mean, basically I was going also to propose consumer like an Uber, but I mean, I would stop there, I will not do it. But I like it a lot. The lady, and afterwards the gentleman.
There is a very important point related to the security of supply. Now, if I am looking to the consumer side, as he wants to cover his own consumption, but there is another big issue, we have to take it as a planner or regulator in the country regarding the reserve, security of supply, continuous service to the consumer by the end. So if this self-consumption plant somewhere happens something, it is in fault and that it cannot be supplied by himself. So he has to rely on the grid itself. And even at the same time, for the telecommunication, yes, it is advanced and even there is much competitive in the market. If you are not connecting to this company, you can go to another. But on the other hand, in the electric system, you have just one wire in your house. So if this wire is cut off, so there is no source of supplying your own consumption. The critical issue in this situation, so you have to be careful regarding the security of supply. So it begins from the generator side to transmission distribution. If it is in a good quality and in a good service, you reach it as a consumer. So the self-consumption from the consumer side, from my point of view, and from our experience regarding the regularity issues, it covers part of his consumption. Mainly, sometimes it depends on 100% of covering his consumption. But by the end, if there is a cutoff in his source, he has to rely again on the grid itself. So security of supply is very important and a critical issue in this regard.
Any comment from the panel?
Yeah, okay.
Jen.
Just to add to the comment about artificial intelligence, actually a project we are launching, in fact the project that probably brought me here, because I had talked about it in Algiers, is blockchain trading of energy. Because first of all, today you have tens, hundreds of thousands of small power plants, and a blockchain system can enable consumer and producer to find themselves and set price independently, efficiently, and cheaply. This works even better for electric car chargers, because if we believe that Europe is going to go to practically full electrification in 20, 30 years, that means we're going to have tens of millions of chargers. Now, you either have to build those in the roads, or else another system would be for the people who have their own chargers to have an outside connection and via a blockchain-based system be able to sell, because you're only using your charger for a few hours a week. So then you can sell the excess time at a fixed rate, and of course you as regulators will have to come in to set the terms, to set the maximum terms, minimum terms, etc. But at the same time, it seems like a logical evolution now that you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of individual producers of electricity, but also very soon you will have thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who have charging points. Why limit those charging points to their own use when they can share them with others? So kind of, my Egyptian colleague, the Uber economy in a way. And I tend to agree that maybe that's the way we have to move. Thank you.
May I have a question? What's the energetic expenditure of those blockchain contracts when you rise to the zettabyte dimension?
No, of course. All those things have to be taken into account. But
I mean, the exchange of the value of the energy exchanged could be less than the contract that manage that exchange. It's a paradox.
no, because if you do the blockchain right, the cost of the exchange should be quite low. Now, of course, you're right that we have to analyze that. Right now, it's at research stage, but it seems, especially when it comes to the car charging, I think if it's not blockchain, it's something else. But I think it would be a shame if I have an electric car and I have a charger, if that charger is only used 6 hours a week. So finding a way for it to be shared.
That might be something that energy communities will go increasingly into. I would think also that just like one of the things is with appliances and monetizing using artificial intelligence is that there are now already some companies that are looking into monetizing the fact that by using aggregators, that looking at whether your appliance needs maintenance or not, and the consumer can actually sort of monetize that with the supplier. The same thing could be for electric vehicles. So I would imagine something like that. I'll also point out, though, that one other option besides the two you mentioned for large-scale deployment, of course, is using the public lighting grid, which is actually a company already doing in the UK and Germany.
Ms. Portugal, you had.
Yes, I'm going to do the old lady in the room. And I mean, there's a lot of subjects. The challenges for regulators are huge. And we see them all at the same time and try to approach them all at the same time. We are not going to do it. So let's split it in different subjects. I don't have the best idea of how communications did evaluate in the past. I would prefer that energy would not evaluate in the same way, at least in what consumers concern. on, and actually you don't have in communications normally the same problem that you raised, that you have security of supply, and you have risk to persons and to people and to assets, so you don't have that in communication, and you have to balance exactly security of supply and supply, universal supply in energy, and you can live without it in communications, although you need energy to have communications. What I used to say is it's not the regulator that is going to lead innovation. That's companies that will do. Companies have to present solutions. The regulator cannot be an obstacle to it. But it's not the role of the regulator to lead it, to lead this way. So just go along, see what's going on, and be very close to companies and to consumer associations. Try to find the best solutions and try to have the balanced solutions. Have pilots, have projects that is testing. Because everything is moving very, very, very fast. So trying to split it, see one at a time what is connected with what. And just to head on data protection, and we have advanced and we have made some regulations on digital meters this year. And we had quite a long bilateral conversation on data with the data protection authorities that still, after having made quite a few concessions on the data that can be available to suppliers and always having the authorization of the consumer, they still think that's very dangerous. So data protection rules, and we are talking about European rules, may also be an obstacle to moving so fast as some of you probably would like to go. But I think the best note is not the regulator to lead innovation, not to be an obstacle. That would be enough, and for now.
Right, we are at the end of our panel, and yeah, exactly, I was going to make a call for a last question. So there is one at the last row. Anybody else? So last question and you wrap up.
Thank you. I am Hamdi from the Palestinian Regulator. I have a question to Mr. Charles. Do you have studies about the effect of the prosumers on national targets?
On which?
National targets.
For example, like on climate targets and so forth. Yeah,
no,
okay.
I mean the renewable energy in general, like renewable energy in general.
Well, we certainly have statistical studies. They're not from CEER so much as they're from national authorities, but there certainly is information available that we haven't done an exact comparison analysis of, for example, how much rooftop solar is contributing versus wind or so forth. I think that there are other sources have really done that rather than CEER. But certainly the information's out there. I've seen it.
Perfect. So we close it here. I still take for the last time this afternoon the freedom to say the last word. By saying, I mean, the note that I took is that partner aggregation and platform creation enable companies and consumers to become players in the electricity market, and the regulators regulate it all. So basically they all agree with it. Thank you very much for your interventions, the lively discussion and the questions.